It's not too often that I've been in this country. In fact, possibly just the second time in 2 or 3 decades. So it's wonderful to be here. And I wrote to a friend just before I came here saying, Belgian chocolates are not good for the back, because I have back problems and I'm already carrying more on the front here in order to carry the back out there. But they are delicious to the palate. The question of meaning and the search for meaning, really it's a worldwide struggle. It has been a worldwide phenomenon. And my interpreters are going to kill me with these first 2 illustrations, but they'll at least get the gist of it, and I'm slowing down. I remember when I spoke for Billy Graham in Amsterdam 83 and Amsterdam 86, I remember walking into the interpreters hall. There were about 120 interpreters, and they do it simultaneously. And as I walked in, I overheard one interpreter saying to the other, "Here comes Machine Gun Zacharias." Now, as the years have gone by, it's more like a water pistol rather than a machine gun, but they're going to struggle with some issues. I hope they'll at least be able to gather. When gentlemen or ladies, when you're talking, if I just wax too eloquent at times, just tell him, right now it's nothing important. We'll get to it as soon as he gets to the meat of what he's going to say. But I don't know how many of you have heard the story of Sherlock Holmes with Watson on a camping trip. You know, they'd had an excessive amount of liquid refreshment at night and went to sleep under their tent, and halfway through the night, Holmes woke up and looked at Watson and said, "Watson, look up into the night sky and tell me what you see." And Watson said, "You know, astronomically, I see that there are millions of galaxies and potentially billions of planets." He said, "Astrologically, I see that Saturn is in Leo. Orologically, I see that it's about 2:45 in the morning. Meteorologically, I see that tomorrow will probably be a nice day. And theologically, I see that this is a vast universe and we are just a minute part of the great whole. Why, Holmes, what do you see?" He said, "Watson, you idiot, somebody has stolen our tent." You can give all of the big sounding words of how to define the universe, but in the process, oftentimes, the tent that holds together the basic ideas of human essence and value has been stolen. All the big terms are used, but you look out into the night sky and you say, what does it really mean to be a human being anymore? I remember being asked to do a lecture on this at Johns Hopkins, along with Francis Collins, the co-mapper of the human DNA, in the great genome project that he did, along with another scientist. And as we were there and many other worldviews were speaking, I kept looking at the subject, what does it mean to be human? And I thought to myself, isn't it funny that we're here in the 21st century and we don't know what it means to be human? If we don't know what it means to be human, what does humanism really mean? It's just an ism to a term we don't understand. But big words are used all along. And you think to yourself, you say, you know, dogs really don't get together for a conference to discuss the meaning of dogginess. It's not an issue to them. By instinct, they just live out dogginess. We're the ones who are the smartest ones on the planet, and we don't know who we really are. But the terms are getting bigger and bigger. Coming from the East, we wrestle with these issues. We've wrestled with these issues historically, philosophically. I don't know any Eastern philosopher who hasn't struggled with this. And I remember growing up in Delhi, where India was my homeland. I lived in India till I was 20, growing up in Delhi, so very comfortable, very fluent in Hindi. My mother was from Chennai in the south, so I'm quite comfortable with the southern Indian language of Tamil as well. And listening to those songs, it's the poets that really ask the haunting questions. In northern India, in Delhi, there was a song that went like this. The Hindi may not mean anything to you, but I will translate it. In one of India's most famous movies, probably its all-time greatest movie, which is called Mother India, went like this. Duniya mein hum aaye hain to jeena hi padega, jeevan hai agar zahar hai to peena hi padega. If I have come into this world, I have to live. If living means a gradual consumption of poison, I have to drink it. It's the way it's said. Na main Bhagwan hu, na main shaitan hu. I'm not God, I'm not Satan. Duniya jo chaho samjhe. O world, think whatever you will. Main to insan hu. I'm merely a human being. I'm not God, I'm not Satan, I'm only a human being. Coming into this world, I don't know what it means, but if it means a gradual drinking of poison, I will drink it. And so the philosophers wax eloquent and the poets wax eloquent, and they ask the question of meaning. Malcolm Muggeridge, writing in the 1970s, the great British journalist, said, "It is difficult to resist the conclusion that 20th century man has decided to abolish himself. Tired of the struggle to be himself, he has created boredom out of his own affluence, impotence out of his own erotomania, and vulnerability out of his own strength. He himself blows the trumpet that brings the walls of his own cities crashing down, until at last, having educated himself into imbecility, having drugged and polluted himself into stupefaction, he keels over a weary, battered old brontosaurus and becomes extinct." Educated himself into imbecility, becomes so educated and so idiotic at the same time. Aldous Huxley, writing in the 1940s, as a skeptic, said, "We are living today not in the delicious intoxication of the early successes of science, rather in the grisly morning after, where it has become quite apparent that what science may have actually done is to introduce us to improved means in order to obtain hitherto unimproved or rather deteriorated ends. What science may have done is increased our methods for ultimately contemptible goals." So if thinkers and philosophers raise this issue of human destiny, while at the same time not really knowing what is the meaning of human essence, it's a quandary of unimaginable proportions. How do we deal with it? How do we respond to it? You know, we can respond to it from theological terms, and the world's religions will pitch in. Hinduism may make you equal with the divine in its pantheistic worldview. Islam may make you so distant from the divine that you wonder if there's ever a bridge between the totally transcendent God and a minute, finite human being. Christianity may confer upon you the imago Dei, the image of God, which tells you that you have that propensity for moral movement and direction, but you still cannot lift yourself up by your own moral bootstraps. All these definitions may come, and when you and I are alone in our rooms, we ask ourselves the question, what does life really mean? I heard today while we were driving in here that over 100 people chose to take their lives by jumping in front of a train in Belgium last year. Japan records a very high number of suicides. As a matter of fact, my own journey to Christ began on a bed of suicide when I was 17 years old. Why? Because I could not find any meaning in life or any explanation. You see, when you go through the history of thought, you go into maybe from the 11th to the 14th centuries, you're dealing with the philosophy that moved towards rationalism with a capital R. Man was going to become the measure of all things by human reason alone, that mathematics was the only indubitably certain discipline. But you moved beyond that, and you realize that as the Renaissance and the Enlightenment came, man was indeed going to become the measure of all things, but nobody said which man. He was going to strive to get there. Then you arrived in the 18th century, and people like David Hume, the Scottish philosopher, and others were looking for certainty and said it was only ultimately in the empirical worldview, by the ways of scientific measurement, that we would find out what was true. So from rationalism with a capital R, we went to the empiricist who was going to define life. After the empiricist had done his work in the 1900s, nihilism came to be, the philosophy of unyielding despair. And on the heels of that came existentialism, will to power, will to passion, will to meaning, that in the face of despair, you choose to arrogate to yourself whatever meaning you want to follow, a la Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus and the rest of them who became very popular existentialist writers. So from rationalism to empiricism to existentialism, and now where are you and I? In the world of postmodernism, which debunks all of these and arrives at categories of no truth, no meaning, no certainty. Language itself is questioned, whether the author reserves the right to fuse the word with a rightful meaning, or the reader reserves the right to interpret the author in any way he or she chooses. So meaning is tossed up into the winds, and you grab the grains that you really want, moving from the mathematical, indubitable uncertainty through the laboratory to man becoming the measure of all things, and will to passion and power, ultimately, that none of these have absolute points of reference. You have to find it in your own way and in your own time, and that's where the postmodern worldview is. But nobody really wants a postmodernist for a pilot. Yeah, I know my instruments say 10,000 feet, but why believe the instruments? I have a feeling it's not 10,000 feet. There are absolutes. There are unshakable absolutes. So what I want to do, ladies and gentlemen, in the time that we have this morning, or this evening, it's morning for me. I've just flown in from Thailand last night, and it's a 12-hour difference. I looked at it here, and it's actually 2 a.m. for me, so I might sound like that as well. But you move into these categories, and you ask yourself the question, what is meaning? How do I find it? Some years ago in Western Canada, in the city of, I won't name the city, it was in Midwestern Canada. There was a packed audience, and a woman from my part of the world was sitting in the front row every night. And she would take notes, copious notes, as I would speak. And I wondered what she was really writing. Very heavily into her notes. And on the last night, she came up to me and she said, "Can I talk to you?" I said, "Yes." So we sat down in the front row and she talked. She said, "My husband was a very prominent medical doctor in this city." She said, "I can take you to one street where there are 3 or 4 apartment buildings owned by us. Very well to do." She said, every night he would wake up in the middle of the night, go out and do some rounds. He was a very conscientious doctor. For all the surgeries performed, he would go and check into his patients, come back again about 3 or 4 in the morning, get a little sleep, go back to work the next day and do his surgeries. She said, so on this one night, he got up and left, and I didn't think anything of it. She said, I was aware that he had come back because I could sense the kitchen light was on, but it was a usual routine for him, so I didn't do anything. I just went back to sleep. She said, all of a sudden, I was awakened with a tremendous thud, a bang, a loud noise. I shook up in bed. I called for my husband. He didn't answer. I got up of bed, walked over to the kitchen, and there he was with his head down on the kitchen table, and I knew something was wrong. I walked over towards him, and he was gone. And in front of him, a note paper with a pen beside it. Some people die natural deaths. Other people, unable to face life anymore, choose to take it. That is my choice. I wish you all goodbye as my family, and I'm sorry I'm leaving you like this. And this Indian woman, crying in the front row of an auditorium, angry at all of this, him leaving her with all the young children to take care of, and all of the affairs that had to be settled, she said, I want to ask you why. Why does anybody do this? I looked at her and I said, I cannot answer that question for you. I don't even know your husband. It's the first time I'm talking to you. But I will tell you one thing. For many human beings, despair is not a moment, it's a way of life. Despair is not just a moment, it is a way of life. It's true. And it's not true necessarily of the world of poverty. It is often more true of the world of wealth. When you have got everything you ever dreamed about. It was Jack Higgins, the award-winning novelist, who was interviewed after his award-winning book, The Eagle Has Landed, was asked the question, what do you now know that you'd wished you'd known as a younger man? He said, I wished I'd known then what I know now, that when you get to the top, there's nothing there. I wished I'd known then what I know now, that when you get to the top, there's nothing there. Can I try and give to you in the simplest terms I can, what are the rudimentary components that bring meaning to life? And it'll start off from the picture in the eyes of a child and ultimately move into the world of an adult. So please bear with me. But these, I believe, are the components needed. So when I talk about meaning in life, I believe these four have a confluence of coming together into a composite, into a whole. They cannot stand in isolation. So if you take any one of these in isolation, it'll implode under its own weight. But you bring them together with the other components and you will see exactly what I mean. So bear with me till I unfold my argument. I wrote a book called Recapture the Wonder. And that is really the outline of what I want to bring to you. How does one find meaning in life? What are the hints we find at the stages of life, if you will, in which these components ultimately must come together? The first is the component of what I call the sense of wonder or enchantment. The sense of wonder or enchantment. We all know that in the eyes of a baby. We all see that in the eyes of an infant. Whether it's a Christmas tree that the eyes get wide at, or whether it's hearing some sound that is enchanting for the first time. G.K. Chesterton, the moralist philosopher, said, I learned more from observing a nursery than I ever did in my lectures in philosophy. I have only in the last 7 months become a grandfather. I know I don't look like it, but it is quite a daunting thought to suddenly realize you are married to a grandmother. That's the way life is. And she would have her own say on that, I have no doubt. But you know, when you're young and you have your kids the first time around, life is hectic, you're earning a living, you're doing all of this, and you don't really take time to watch all the thrills as much as you need to. Now at this stage in life, when you hold a tiny little one, that's your grandchild, in your arms, and you begin to see the thrill of a little one with each new experience, you realize how marvelous and how beautiful life is all about, really. I'd been traveling for 7 weeks with my traveling associate, Kryn, and we'd been gone to many countries, and I'd been praying each day that whenever this little grandchild was born, that I would be there. And I was on pins and needles for those 7 weeks that he would come a little too early, and I'd be miles away, and my daughter would never forgive me. We arrived on a certain day at 3 p.m., and I was in the train in the Atlanta airport going to the baggage claim, and I turned to Kryn and I said, I wonder if it'll happen today now that I'm home. We got home at 5:15 p.m. At 6:15, our phone rang. My son-in-law saying we're on our way to the hospital. The baby's coming any minute. And within an hour, we were there, and I held my little grandson in my arms. I have been known to induce labor in a lot of people, but it was nice to have done that in my own daughter's case. I held that little one in my arms, all of 5 pounds and 10 ounces. It's a magnificent sense to hold that child. 2 days later, I was in a bank talking to one of our bank tellers. They asked me, how's Naomi doing? I said, they know my daughter Naomi. I said, the baby's here, newly born baby. And I looked at the teller and I said, you know what? When I look at a baby like that, I say to myself, how does anyone not believe in God? And you know what she said? And how does anyone ever think of hurting a little one like that? The two realities of life immediately converged in discussing a newborn baby, the wonder of life and the hideousness of human depravity. That you can see something so magnificent and yet recognize that there are capacities. In fact, the first thing the nurse said to her when she came into the room, while my wife and I were there, are to give her the security protection for the baby and the wristband so that if that child were ever taken into an elevator on that floor anywhere, it would trigger an alarm system. And imagine a young mother who's just held her little baby in her arms being told of the possibility of a child being kidnapped. Shocking, absolutely shocking. Now you watch that little child grow and the enchantment and wonder. And then you find out how marvelous the fairy tales really are. And you start reading the fairy tales as they get older. And you noticed two things about every fairy tales. There is the extraordinary thing that you notice, the world of enchantment. But then two things come into that fairy tale very quickly. If you don't come back by such and such, you will become a such and such. It's always a condition. If you don't come back by 12 o'clock, you'll become a pumpkin. That sort of stuff. And no one ever says to the fairy godmother, how come? G.K. Chesterton says, because if you say to the fairy godmother, how come, you may as well be prepared for the fairy godmother to say to you, how come there is even a fairyland? There's always a condition, and there's always the recognition of the mystery that you don't always question every condition. The conditions are there for life. Now, what I want to say to you is this. If you take wonder away, and you take enchantment away, you take the mystique and the mystery away of a little life, and as life goes on, two things will happen. You know, what the first thing will happen? The first thing that will happen is you will lose a sense of gratitude and think you owe nothing to anybody. You are really the provider of all of your needs. The loss of gratitude always follows the loss of a sense of wonder. I lived and grew up in Delhi. I never earned a penny in my pocket until I left India at 20 years old. I never even received any pocket money. I just knew how to make friends with kids who got pocket money. And I knew how to enjoy all those things with people who had it. I never had it. And I always dreamed of the great day that you could go somewhere to the West and start earning money and making it big time. And in a strange way, that dream came. I went when I was 20 and moved to Toronto, Canada, and lived in Toronto, studied there, went into business and was preparing all of that. And I noticed some of the loneliest people in the world. I was in the hotel business. Some of the loneliest people in the world would be sitting there at night with something in their hand to drown their sorrows and drown their monotony and drown their boredom. And I found myself trying to answer questions of people who had 10 times more than I did. Now in America, we're in a quandary financially. We borrowed and borrowed and borrowed against that which we could not repay. In English, you have a saying of certainty. You can take that to the bank, but you better not say that now. Have you insured that? You're not sure about the insurance companies now. You're not sure about the banks now. And for the first time in about 40 years of living in the West, I drive past shopping centers and malls where you see tiny businesses shut down. And it has all come on the heels of the last 20 or 25 years of irresponsible living that has come hand in hand with the rejection of the place of God in human destiny. We don't want to, you can go to the Forbidden City in Beijing today on a given day in December and see Merry Christmas, and yet in the United States, you take your life in your hands in a public institution if you put up a sign called Merry Christmas. Somebody from the American Civil Liberties Union will want to sue you for that. They want to ban prayer in schools. I saw a bumper sticker that said, as long as there are mathematics examinations, there will always be prayer in schools. It's true. Because you may know that 2 plus 2 is 4, but the next question is going to stump you. God, please help me. But that's what's happened to us in the West. We've lost our belief in the transcendent power because we've lost our sense of gratitude. They don't want to call it Christmas anymore or Thanksgiving anymore. They call it Turkey Day, which may say more about the people than it does about the turkey. Amazing. Amazing. You know what? When you don't pause long enough to thank God even for your health and your strength, you are actually saying you are totally self-contained in all that you need. A man looked at Winston Churchill one day and said, "I'm a self-made man." Churchill looked at him and said, "You have just relieved God of a very solemn responsibility." You lose your sense of wonder. You lose your sense of gratitude. You know, some years ago, there was an Air Canada flight coming in from somewhere, I think in Connecticut to Cincinnati or something like that. It was flying into Toronto, and there was a fire that started in the washroom of the plane, and the fire started to spread. I remember being there at that time and reading about it, and this plane literally had to plummet in height. And it landed in Toronto and hit the ground so hard in the runway, the wheels broke on landing, and when the doors opened, it was turned into an inferno. And what happened was the fire engines and all ready, people were rescued. The last man to leave the cabin was the pilot himself while his uniform had begun to catch fire and the flames were doused. He refused to give any interviews on it because it was such a sobering, scary moment. But he rescued with his staff all of the passengers on board. What happened the next day was one passenger after another saying, "We thank that pilot for his skill and his courage. He brought us down safely, and he was the last man to leave after every passenger had disembarked and been rescued." If you were on that plane, you'd want to thank that captain too. It was just a few days later, an American airliner was coming back from the Bahamas somewhere, and it lost power in one engine, 2, 3, and finally the 4th, and the pilot's voice was heard saying, "Ditching is inevitable." Until all of its own, one engine started, and he limped back to safety. Who do you thank then? As G.K. Chesterton said, if I have Santa Claus to thank for putting 2 feet into my stocking on Christmas Day, for putting candy in my stocking on Christmas Day, have I got nobody to thank for putting 2 feet into my own stockings? You lose the sense of wonder, you will lose the sense of gratitude. Not only will you lose the sense of gratitude, it will ultimately lose the sense of obligation and limitation as well. We don't like the 10 Commandments. Why? Because they limit us. But if you were to take the 10 Commandments and reduce it to one word, do you know what that word is? Sacred. Sacred. Your life is sacred. My life is sacred. I cannot violate you. Your property is sacred. Your marriage is sacred. Your time is sacred. Your worship is sacred. That's what the 10 Commandments are all about. The sacredness of your life and your work and your relationships and your commitment. And you desacralize life, everything becomes profane. Chesterton once said, anytime you remove a fence, always pause long enough to ask why it was put there in the first place. Whenever you remove any fence, ask why it was put there in the first place. You take away wonder, you will lose gratitude. You take away wonder, you will lose a sense of limitation. And you take away wonder, you will ultimately lose a sense of fulfillment. Wonder is indispensable, and I'll tell you why this is so critical to understand. You know, we have 3 children. And I noticed something very fascinating from my reading and applying it to them. They're 3 years apart. They're all grown and married and settled, and I have the privilege of them working with me now. It's a great thrill. But when they were young, if I took the 3 of them, aged 1, 4, and 7, and started to tell them the same fairy tale, if I told Sarah at age 7 a fairy tale, and I went something like this: Sarah, little Tommy got up and walked up to the door and opened the door, and a dragon jumped in front of Tommy. Sarah's eyes would get wide. If I told the same story to Naomi at age 4, I wouldn't have to go that far. You know what I'd have to say? Little Tommy got up and walked up to the door, and Tommy opened the door. And Naomi's eyes would get like that. With Nathan, it would be the shortest story at age 1. I'd have to say, Nate, little Tommy got up and walked up to the door. At age 1, it's pretty big just to walk up to a door. What's happening here? The older you get, the more it takes to fill your heart with wonder. And only God is big enough to fill that heart. That's why in December of 1968, when the human eye was given a glimpse of this earth that no human eye had ever seen, when the American astronauts went around the dark side of the moon, we were all sitting with bated breath in front of our televisions to watch what would happen and when we'd hear the first words. And they came round the dark side of the moon and saw Earth rise over the horizon of the moon, draped in a beauteous mixture of blue and white against the black void of space, garlanded by the glistening light of the sun. What were the first words coming from the astronaut? Unrehearsed. No philosopher, no poet, no scientist told him to say this. He looked at that earth from a distance and he said, "In the beginning, God." In the beginning, God. The sense of wonder, it's needed. But you know what? Life has a way of moving on, and you come to a very difficult conclusion. The conclusion is this: you can't always live with wonder. You can't. You see the girl of your dreams, you put your hand in her hand, you look into her eyes, and you think 1 + 1 would make 1,000,000. And you stumble and, you find the nicest words. You don't look at her and say, "How would you like to be buried with my ancestors?" That's not what you say. You look at her and your heart is beating a mile a minute. And you just want to, I remember when my in-laws, my wife's from Canada, my in-laws, when they were married, he was with the Canadian Air Force and all of that and became an engineer. She got mad at him because when they registered the first night for their honeymoon, the name, he just put down Lieutenant H.L.C. Reynolds, and she nudged him and said, "What about me?" So he said, "I'm awfully sorry, Lieutenant and Mrs. H.L.C. Reynolds," and he apologized to her. He said, "Don't make the same mistake I did." I said, "Okay, I won't." So I took their daughter, went. We were in Niagara Falls, Ontario, spending the first night in our honeymoon, and boldly I wrote Mr. and Mrs. Ravi Zacharias. And she nudged me because a number in party, I put 1. And the man behind the counter noticed and said, "At least it shows you he's led a good life." Just put 1. You're walking in a dream, you're walking in a cloud. And then comes the first disagreement. And when you come to the first disagreement, you're absolutely convinced if she would only listen to your wisdom, you'd both be right. And the years go by, and you find out that you're not always floating on cloud 9. But what keeps that commitment intact is not the feeling, but the fact of your commitment. And with wonder, if you only live with the enchantment, you'll find out that these fairy stories are not true, they're merely fantastic. What you need to find in life is that which is fantastically true. It's not fantasy, but it's fantastically true. So the most important component in life is not merely the sense of wonder, but the recognition of what is ultimately true. That's exactly what the Greeks talked about. Truth, beauty, goodness, liberty, equality, justice. Truth, beauty, goodness, liberty, equality, justice. Ideas by which we live and ideas by which we judge. But it took the Hebrews to remind you and me that these are not abstract ideas. They are enveloped in a very person, the person of God. You can't talk about absolutes without a transcending point of reference. You cannot talk about ultimate beauty because even beauty has to have boundaries. You cannot talk about liberty unless human beings have essential worth. You know, I looked at the European newspaper today, and it reads like almost any newspaper on any continent today, all having to do with fiscal need, environmental issues, and all of them. They're all very, very important. But the one thing that's conspicuous by its absence in many of these newspapers is why? Why? Why is a human being valuable? Why is your freedom valuable? Why is your self-sustenance valuable? It's because God has endowed you with essential worth. You're not worthy because a community gives you worth. You are essentially worthy. That's the important point that I think we have to find in meaning. You know, somebody looked at a tax collector looked at Jesus once and said, "Is it all right to pay taxes to Caesar?" I wish Jesus had answered that differently. I wish he'd said absolutely not. Then at least in America on April 15th, I could be rebellious and godly at the same time. So I refuse to pay my taxes, and I'm doing it because I'm a godly man. Jesus said, "Do you have a coin?" The man said, "Yes." He said, "Give me that coin." And he lifted that coin and he looked at the coin and he said to the man, "Whose image do you see on this coin?" The man said, "Caesar." Jesus said, "Give to Caesar that which is Caesar's and give to God that which is God's." The man walked away. He should have had one more question. You know what question he should have had? What belongs to God? And you know what Jesus would have said? Whose image is on you? Whose image is on you? Here's the coin, the image of Caesar. Give to Caesar that which is Caesar's. Give to God that which is God's. What belongs to God? Whose image is on you? That, I think, is something so conspicuous by its absence. Malcolm Muggeridge raises the question of truth in two ways. Follow me very carefully, please, because the first is experiential, the second is philosophical. Here's the experiential one. In this Sargasso sea of fantasy and fraud, how can I or anyone else hope to swim unencumbered? How can I learn to see through and not with the eye? How can I take off my own makeup, raise the iron shutter, put out the studio lights, silence the sound effects, and put the cameras to sleep? Will I ever see the sun rise on Sunset Boulevard and set over Forest Lawn? Can I ever find furniture among the studio props, silence in a discotheque, love in a striptease, read truth off an auto cue, catch it on a screen or chase it on the wings of Muzak? Can I view it in living color with the news or hear it in living sound along the motorways? No, not in the wind that rent the mountains and broke in pieces the rocks, not in the earthquake that followed, nor in the fire that followed the earthquake. It is in a still small voice, the voice of God, not in the screeching of tires or in the grinding of brakes or the roar of jets or the whistle of sirens or the howl of trombones, the rattle of drums or the chanting of demo voices. Again and again and again, I say to myself, it must be in that still small voice, the voice of God, if one can only catch it. Muggeridge, who was a journalist, especially in Russia in the dark days for the Manchester Guardian, said this, you know, truth is very beautiful, more than justice, which easily puts on a false face. In the nearly 7 decades I have lived through, the world has overflowed with bloodshed and explosions whose dust has never had time to settle before others have erupted, all in supposedly just causes. For the quest of justice continues while the weapons of hatred pile up. But truth was an early casualty, the lies on behalf of which our wars have been fought and our peace treaties concluded, the lies of revolution and counter-revolution, the lies of advertising, of news, of salesmanship, of politics, the lies of the priest in his pulpit, the professor at the podium, and the journalist at his typewriter, the lies stuck like a fishbone in the throat of the microphone, the handheld lies of the prowling cameraman. Ignatius Saloni told me once how when he was a member of the old Comintern, some stratagem was under discussion, and a delegate, a newcomer who had never attended before, made the extraordinary observation in the middle of the discussion that if such and such a statement were to be made, it wouldn't be true and so ought not to be made. There was a moment of dazed, stunned silence, and then everyone began to laugh. They laughed and laughed till tears ran down their cheeks, and the Kremlin walls seemed to shake. The same laughter echoes in every council chamber and cabinet room. Wherever 2 or more are gathered to exercise authority, it is truth that has died, not God. That comes from a world-renowned journalist. The lie stuck like a fishbone in the throat of the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, a man stood in front of Jesus once and said, "What is truth?" and walked away without waiting for the answer. You know what the truth is? The truth is that your heart and my heart are both desperately wicked. But we don't like it. And you know what the truth is? Only God is big enough to change it and transform it. And unless we find that point of reference for an absolute truth, what is an absolute? An absolute is an unchanging point of reference. Have you ever been at a stoplight when the light is red and you've stopped? I'm sure that happens in Belgium. In India, we think it's a Christmas light and we move on. But you stop at a red light. And then you're daydreaming and you look at the next lane and you see his car moving, but you're not sure if it's his car or your car, and the light is still red. What do? Automatically, you press the brake harder to make sure you're not moving. But after you press your brake harder and you're not sure whether that guy is moving or you're moving, What do you do next? You look onto the road to look for a tree or a lamppost or something that's not supposed to be moving, and you're measuring yourself by that object. What would happen if the trees and the lampposts moved as well? That's what postmodernism has done to you and me. There is no point of reference to find out whether you're progressing or regressing. That's what it's done. And the fact of the matter is, we need to find the way of the truth. And that way of the truth is an absolute unchanging point of reference. You know, the interesting thing about the message of Jesus Christ, he doesn't tell you, here is the truth. He says to you, I am the truth. He is the point of reference for truth. And they that are on the side of truth, said he, listen to me. Let me tell you one quick thought here and move to my final two thoughts. Wonder and truth. I was on a peace mission in the Middle East with the former Archbishop of Canterbury, William Carey, and we were meeting with all of the leaders, or religious leaders from the Jewish side and the Palestinian side. It was a tough 5 or 6 days, very tough. We were exhausted. And the last but one day, we were meeting with one of the 4 founders of Hamas. His name was Sheikh Talal. Solidly built man. He'd lost several members of his family and was very courteous, and he served us a beautiful lunch. And I was just one of the 5, and the Archbishop carried the lead, so we would just listen. But before any session was over, the Archbishop would give the 5 of us a chance to ask one question. And the Sheikh had all of his cohorts around him. I asked him a question, and I didn't like the answer. I said, Sheikh, you and I might never meet again, and you may not like my saying this, but I really don't like your answer to my question. I said, but can I say something to you, sir? I said, 5,000 years ago, not far from where you and I are sitting, was a mountain. And a man by the name of Abraham went up that mountain and took his son up to offer his son as a sacrifice. Do you remember the story? He said, yes. I said, please do me a favor. Let's not argue now about which son that was. I said, let's agree it was Abraham and his son. He said, okay. I said, he takes his son up that mountain, and he sees it as a test of his faith before God, whether he's willing to give up his son. And the axe is about to come down on the son, and God stops that arm. Do you remember the story? He said, yes. I said, do you remember what God said to him? Sheikh Talal just stared at me. I said, do you remember that? He said, no. I said, you have it in the scriptures. God said, stop. Stop, Abraham. I myself will provide. He said, yes. I said, Sheikh, very close to where you and I are sitting, 2,000 years ago, God kept that promise. He took his own son up that hill, and this time the axe did not stop. He just stared at me. I said, Sheikh, until you and I receive the son that God has provided, we will be offering our own sons and daughters on the battlefields of this world for land, position, power, ownership, and prestige. Silence in the room, full of smoke. The Archbishop said, well, I guess we can now go back to our hotels. I said, oh, brother, I've blown it big time. So we were walking, and just as I was about to go down the stairs, the Archbishop put his arm around me and said, thank you, Ravi. So that was of God. I said, I sure hope so. I went down, and the Archbishop was the guest of honor, so we were all getting into our car on the other side. The Sheikh followed me. He came over to me and he took me by the shoulders, and I thought, farewell world, it's been good. He said, Mr. Zacharias. I said, yes, sir. He just stared at me, kissed me on both sides of the face. He said, you're a good man. I hope I see you again someday. Ladies and gentlemen, in this book is a story. It's a story that is historically sustained on the crucifixion of Christ. And to reveal to you and me that third component of meaning, wonder, truth, and love. What does love mean? Love means where you are loved for your own sake in spite of yourself. You are not to become anybody else. Your loved and essential worth is given to you. This is now my 40th year of travel with many countries. I spent half the year on the road. And I'll tell you what, I've been now on the road for nearly 4 weeks. And day after tomorrow, we go home. And as wonderful as the rest of the stops are, it's wonderful to get back home, where you are loved in spite of yourself. God's love for you is very unique. God has blessed this continent of Europe in spite of all of its pain and agony. You have food on your table. You have the luxury of a comfortable life. Don't let the goodness of God lead you to reject Him. And that's what so easily happens. When I think of love, I find it very hard to understand how anybody can live without it. Bertrand Russell once made the comment that there are 3 things in life I have not understood, for I've never had it. One of them, he said, was love. This great philosopher never had love, and therefore never found he actually belonged in this world. You know, the greatest search in life is ultimately to belong and to love. I'll deal with that at a greater extent tomorrow. But you grow up in Delhi hearing stories, you know, it's unbelievable. In my culture, you learn through proverbs and through stories and then argument, not the other way around. In the West, we learn through argument and put up with stories. There you learn through stories and proverbs, and then you find the argument. So let me give you this quick one, and I'll lead to my last point. I remember as a little boy, every night, the lady who worked as the maid in the home would tuck us to bed if my parents were out, and we'd always ask her to tell us a story. And she told us a story once which I had reinforced years later and found how rich it was. It's not a true story, it's a parable. It's a parable of a young man in one village who loved another young girl in another village, and he wanted to marry her, but she was not well-intentioned. She was just trying to exploit him and mock him and use him and all of that, but he really loved her. And finally one day she said to him, I will only marry you if you prove to me that you love me more than anyone else in this world. He said, of course I do. That's why I'm asking to marry you. She said, no. You love your mother, I know, much more than you love me. He said, don't be silly. It's a different relationship. They're my parents. You'll be my lover, my wife. It's a complete. She said, no, I want you to prove it to me. If you really love me more than your mother, I want you to take her life and bring me her heart in your hand as my trophy, the trophy of my victory. He said, you're getting ridiculous. She said, no, if you prove to me that you love me more than her, I will marry you. He goes back home, wonders about this, ponders about it, and the story goes on, the parable goes on. He finally finds a knife, stabs his mother, takes the heart out of her chest, and he holds it in his hand, and he's running across the distance to present it to her. Running through a wilderness, he can hardly wait to give it to her, and he stumbles over a thicket, and the heart bounces out of his hand, and he can't find it. He's rummaging through the bushes and the thorns and everything. And all of a sudden he hears a voice as he himself has fallen. As he finds the heart and he's getting up and he dusts his knees, he hears a voice coming out of the heart saying, "Son, are you hurt? Son, are you hurt?" I was a little boy. Nobody needed to interpret for me what this maid was telling us, that the love of a mother is so strong that no dastardly act can stand in the way of that. You tell me, where did that love come from? Chemistry? Oh no. In fact, you will find a weaker mother doing the same thing as a stronger mother. A mother may be stronger in body who will take care of a child who's on the verge of death, and counter-evolution will be willing to pay with her life so that that weaker son and child of hers may still live. It's a love that God pours into your heart and into mine. And here's the key. The clue to meaning in life is in a relationship. It's in a relationship. And you will never have that relationship until you have that relationship with the author of all relationships, God himself. Wonder, truth, love, and finally, security. Where God promises to you and me that death is not the end, death does not hold us, that in the end we stand before him and recognize that life goes on beyond the grave, the eternal. I say to you this, if there is no life beyond the grave, all definitions are up for grabs. All definitions are up for grabs. But if there is life beyond the grave, then there is such a thing as justice. There is such a thing as absolute love. There is such a thing as absolute truth. If there's no life beyond the grave, then these 80 years and 10, if you want to be a rationalist or an empiricist or an existentialist or postmodernist, it's up to you. But if there is an eternal way of measuring truth, then you had better measure by the absolutes of God himself. When I was in my 20s, I was a student in Toronto, and I offered to go to Vietnam because America was at war then. I was living in Canada, but I wanted to go and work with the military chaplains, and I was invited to speak. I was only in my 20s. I was invited to speak mainly to the youth or to maybe some military bases and so on. And I went there. And I'll tell you what, some amazing things happened. I was 25, my interpreter was 17, total age of 42. We were flying by American helicopters, we were on motorbikes. I was single at that time, and I said, well, if anything happens, it happens, you know. And we faced, and thousands of men and women gave their lives to Jesus Christ. I want to tell you a couple of stories with which I close, because it's amazing how these things come to be. After these thousands came to know Christ, I left and bid my interpreter, his name is Hien Pham, goodbye, and I was sure we'd never meet again. But during that time, one American soldier wrote this poem, came into my hands. Lord God, I have never spoken to you, but now I want to say, how do you do? You see, God, they told me you didn't exist, and like a fool I believed all this. Last night from a shell hole I saw your sky. I figured right then they had told me a lie. Had I taken time to see the things you've made, I'd have known they weren't calling a spade a spade. I wonder, God, if you'll take my hand. Somehow I feel that you'll understand. Funny I had to come to this hellish place before I had time to see your face. Well, I guess there isn't much more to say, but I'm sure glad, God, I met you today. I guess 0 hour will soon be here, but I'm not afraid since I know you're near. The signal, well, God, I'll have to go. I like you lots, I want you to know. Look now, this will be a horrible fight. Who knows, I may come to your house tonight. Though I wasn't friendly to you before, I wonder, God, if you'll wait at your door. Look, I'm crying, I'm shedding tears. I'll have to go now, God, goodbye. Strange now since I met you, I'm not afraid to die. We saw stories like this again and again and again. Men and women desperately seeking hope for life beyond the grave. Here's what I want to leave you with. I wrapped my arms around Hien, 17, myself 25. Never going to see you here again. Goodbye. We left. 17 years later, at 11 o'clock at night, I was speaking in Vancouver, British Columbia, and my phone rang in my hotel room. I picked it up, and the voice says, Brother Rafi. I said, Hien? He said, you recognize my voice? I said, you're the only one who ever said, Brother Rafi. I said, where are you? He said, in California. I said, what? I said, what are you doing there? He said, my MBA. I said, you're in California doing your MBA? He said, yeah. I said, what happened? He said, have you got a few minutes? I said, I've got lots of minutes. He said, after you left, Vietnam fell. I was among those arrested and accused of working for the CIA. I told them I never worked for the CIA. They said, oh yeah, your English is so good, you had to be working for them. He said, no, I would interpret for guest speakers and work for the Americans, but I never worked for the CIA. He said, they wouldn't believe me, they put me in prison. They said, nobody ever admits working for the CIA, so they put him in prison. He was in a prison camp. They wouldn't allow him to read anything in English, only in Vietnamese and French. Marx and Engels, Vietnamese and French. That's it. Marx and Engels, Vietnamese and French. Finally, he said, Brother Rafi, they pounded into my head that there was no God. And one day I said, okay, I'm going to live as if there is no God. He said, that day they assigned me to clean the latrines. He said, you've never seen a latrine. He said, you thought you saw horrible latrines when you were with me? He said, you've never seen anything like this. He said, you have to tie a cloth around your nose and mouth to clean it. And I had this bucket and mop, and I was cleaning it, and I looked into one bucket next to a toilet. And I was about to empty the paper, but I noticed there was one piece of paper in English. He said, I looked around, I just quickly washed it and put it into my pocket. He said, everybody went to sleep that night. I waited, took out that wet piece of paper, and with a flashlight, I looked on that piece of paper. On the right, it said Romans chapter 8. And I started to read. And we know that all things work together for good to them that love God and that are called according to His purpose. What shall separate us from the love of God? Shall life or death or this principalities or powers? He said, I started crying. I said, God, today I woke up in the morning saying I will never pray to you again, and now I'm holding in my hand one verse that I needed more than anything else, that all things can work together for good to them that love God. He said, I got on my knees and begged God for forgiveness. He said, I woke up in the morning and went to the commanding office and said, do you mind if I clean the latrines again today? He said, I picked up pages from the New Testament every day. The commander had been given a Bible. He used to tear pages out of it, use it as toilet paper, and throw it into the bin. I washed it, put it into my pocket, and had my devotions at night. He said, finally, one day, they told me they were going to release me. And I was released. I got about 51 or 52 others together, including the son or daughter of the vice president, someone. We were going to build a boat to escape, and we built a boat. Several weeks went by. One day, 4 Viet Cong came knocking on my door. Brother Rafi, and said to me, "You're trying to escape, aren't you?" And he said, I looked at them, plain expression, and said, "No." They said, "Are you telling us the truth?" He said, "Yes." "You're not going to escape?" "No." "You're telling us the truth?" "Yes." He said, they left. He said, I slapped my forehead and said, "Oh my dear God, I've done it again." He said, I prayed a prayer that I hoped would never be answered. I said, "God, forgive me, and if you want me to tell them the truth, bring them back before we escape." Hours before they were to leave, these 4 guys were back, armed to the teeth, grabbed him by the collar, rammed him against a wall. "You're lying. You're trying to escape, aren't you?" He said, "Yes, with 52 others. Are you going to kill me?" They said, "No, we want to go with you." He said, 4 of these Viet Cong came on the boat with us. He said, "Brother Rafi, on the high seas, we were in a storm, we were to capsize, but these 4 men were the best mariners we could have wanted as skippers. They finally brought us safely to Thailand. I became a refugee there and ultimately got my papers. I'm in California now doing my MBA." We flew him to my home because he wanted me to officiate at his wedding. He'd found a beautiful young Vietnamese gal he was going to marry. And he looked at my kids across the kitchen table when they were young, and he said to them, "You know, you always think you're going to manage it your own way. It never works." He said, "The most important thing in your life is to find that intimacy with God, and He will guide you, He will hold you, He will take you through safely in your journey as you walk hand in hand with Him. When everything comes together, then you have wonder, then you have truth, then you have love, and you have security. That's what gives life meaning. And you'll find that only God is big enough to do that for you." God bless you, and thank you for listening to me so carefully. Thank you.